because the water didn't come my way. It went your way.
The wall of water kept pushing south. Levees began to collapse along the Arkansas River. It was already the worst flood on record, and it was aiming all its force at Greenville. In desperation, Percy and his fellow planters pulled their workers from the fields to do battle with the river. They became part of an army of 30,000 men, including convicts, who struggled to raise the height of the levees with rows of sandbags. Still, the river continued to rise. When even more men were needed on the levees, Greenville's police resorted to force.
They started going through Greenville and taking all of the black men. This is another thing that I can remember so plainly. All of the black people, even kids out of school, to go and protect the levee. And almost man for man, or boy for boy, the whites had guns on, and the others had nothing but picks and shovels.
They had shotguns. They just hurried them up and drove them to the levee. Right down Nelson Street, that was the Negro drag at the time, and they just got them off the streets and just carried them right down to the levee and started them to work.
White residents began to panic. Those who could afford it boarded trains leaving the region. Upriver from Greenville, at a great bend in the river, the Mounds Landing levee was showing signs of trouble. On Good Friday, the Delta was battered by the most savage storm of them all. As much as 15 inches of rain fell in 18 hours. One resident recorded in his diary, "Heaven spare us." The Mounds Landing levee was beginning to crumble.
It's cold, damp, rainy. The break is increasing. The water's washing over top of the levee. And according to some accounts, the levee starts feeling loose.
The water started rising an inch an hour. That's fast. That's 2 feet a day. There is a limit to how high you can build sandbags.
They didn't think it was going to hold. In fact, it was getting worse by the minute. They throwing all the sandbags in there they could, and but it just kept getting bigger and bigger, and they couldn't stop it.
The men working on the sandbags know full well there's no way that this thing is going to hold. And they start to abandon the position. And the National Guard officer orders rifles held on them and threatens to shoot them if they leave.
And these fellows were filling their sacks with sand. And my stepfather, he noticed that at the bottom of the levee, some water started coming out. And he grabbed my hand, grabbed my arm, I guess, and he said, "Run, Johnny boy. Run for your life."
And the levee starts shaking and rumbling. And men start running, and all of a sudden, a big section of the levee, several hundred feet wide, just sort of pushes out and carries men with it.
You see them screaming, yelling, blood-curdling yelling. And they were gone. So you let the Mississippi out, and you could almost hear it yelling, "It's free. I'm free again." And man, it came out with a roar. Oof. My stepfather said to me, he said, "God damn." He said, "Remember, Johnny boy, you'll have a lot of close calls in your life. You're not going to have any closer one than this one tonight."
The break at Mounds Landing released more than double the volume of Niagara Falls. It flooded an area 50 miles wide and 100 miles long. It put water over the tops of houses in Yazoo City, 75 miles away. The deluge was cascading south through the cotton fields of Washington County. It was only a matter of hours before the water reached Greenville, inundating the city from the rear. Leroy Percy now faced total disaster. The river was seizing his empire. Up in his room, Leroy's son was writing poetry. Will had been working feverishly through the night. I was in a writer's tantrum, he would later confess. The water rolled toward Greenville, wiping out forests and farms.
It was a sight to see, there's no doubt about it. It's hard to describe. It just had a force to it. It was just...
Oh, my Lord. It's coming from every which way. I was so scared, I didn't know what had happened. I'll tell you the truth, I didn't know. Come late that evening, and you couldn't see nothing but water. You hear people hollering, you know, scared and running every which way, you know. And people get in their boats and things, go searching for them, you know.
When it got light enough for us to see, you could see horses, cows, and dogs, and everything else right in that water drowning. I thought we was all going to drown.
The flood finally reached Greenville in the early morning hours of Friday, April 22nd.
I looked at him and said, "Oh, I see it coming. It's coming." And it was creeping into the gutters, but it was coming fast. Not heavy waves, just seeping in. But I tell you, seeping in a hurry.
10 feet of water inundated downtown. The current at the intersection of Broadway and Main turned deadly.
You could just see the livestock floating dead in the waters. And you know, young children at that time knew everybody's horse and everybody's cow. You say, there goes Mr. Fowler's cow, there goes Mr. Williams' horse, you know, just bloated and floating.
Some residents found safety in the upper floors of stores and churches. Others clung to rooftops. Anyone with a boat was pressed into service.
I had a sea sled at that time with about a 25 or 30 horsepower motor, and I became a rescue captain, which was a great event for me at that time, 14. And so every day we had assigned certain routes, and we'd go out and pick these people up, bring them back to the high ground, and keep going on my route. But I saw these three people, two kids, and what I thought was a very fat black woman on top of a cotton house. And as she got in, she said, "'Fore God, my baby's coming." I said, "What'd you say, ma'am?" He said, "'Fore God, my baby's coming." Well, I said, "Can't you just wait, hold it 40 minutes? I said, I get it to the high ground, and they look after you." She said, "No," so said, "He's coming now." And I thought, what in the world do I do? And she said, "Don't worry," said, "just be real gentle with him." Said, "Just take his head and pull him slowly." And said, "He'll come on out. I'll push." And she pushed and I pulled. And here was a little baby boy. I then dipped him in the Mississippi River, the flood water, and hit him a couple of times, and he started crying. And she said, "Give him to me, I'll take him on my breast." And she lay down, she was still in the dirty water, and she took his baby, put him on her breast. Well, I think I cried. That's all I remember. my first experience of being a midwife. Anyway, I untied the boat, and when we got close to the high ground, I hollered at him. I said, "Look, I've got a new baby, just born." I got the mother up, and as she stepped out of the boat, she turned to me and said, "What's your name, son?" I said, "John." She said, "I'm going to name this baby John." That's the last I saw of her. An amazing woman. Listen. An amazing woman.
For 36 hours, the Delta was in turmoil, in movement, in terror, Will wrote. Then the water covered everything, and a great quiet settled down. Father looked somberly over the drowning town, Will noted. He was tired. But there was work to do. Leroy immediately began raising money for his devastated community and appointed his son head of the Flood Relief Committee. The task before Will was enormous. Up until now, Will was known only for being his father's son. Now, at age 42, he would have the chance to prove himself worthy of the Percy name. Within days, the deluge had covered 27,000 square miles, an area the size of 4 New England states. The flood, one preacher said, had spread as wide as God's arms. More than 1,000 people were dead. Washington County was hardest hit. The water washed away 2,200 buildings, damaged or destroyed thousands more. It displaced tens of thousands of people.
We lose a few clothes and furniture, so we lose everything we had. What little we had, didn't nobody had too much, but whatever, it means a whole lot to you because you didn't have nothing else.
As the rescue efforts expanded, rowboats and skiffs followed power lines to farms and houses. Many whites were evacuated from the region. Blacks were rounded up from the countryside and deposited on Greenville's levee, a narrow island of high ground with the river on one side and flooded land on the other. 2 days after the Mound's Landing break, more than 10,000 refugees crammed the 8-foot-wide crown of the levee in a line that stretched over 5 miles.
There were no tents to start with. There was just a few blankets. And you can see them stretching blankets across a little frame to try to make a tent-like place to stay out of the weather, which was really bad. It was April, it was rainy, it was cold. These people had been out in rescue boats. It was miserable.
The city's water supply was contaminated, its food supply destroyed. With no sanitation facilities, the refugees were at risk for typhoid and cholera. For Will Percy, there was only one honorable course to take: evacuate the black refugees to safer havens downriver. Will immediately called a meeting of the town's relief committee. Convinced that he spoke for his father, the committee agreed to Will's call for an evacuation order. When a group of planters learned of the plan, they were furious. Afraid that they would lose their workers, they demanded that Will rescind the order.
The planters reasoned that if these people ever got away, they may never come back. They wanted to ensure that they had laborers to try to finish out the cotton crop if the water went down that year. And this was a perfect example of that mentality that Mississippi planters had. It didn't really matter if these people were uncomfortable. It didn't really matter if they were starving. And it probably wouldn't have really mattered a whole lot if a lot of them had died for one reason or another. They were going to keep their laborers, and that's this ruthless contempt for human beings.
Will was appalled by the planters' demands and refused to budge. Undaunted, they took their case directly to his father. The next morning, Leroy Percy went searching for his son.
Leroy finds Will on the levee. It's a war scene. There are refugees everywhere. They begin to take a walk. Leroy is suggesting gently that perhaps the evacuation was not the best decision to make. Will is saying it's the only decision. Leroy disagrees. Will is stubborn, insists there's no way he could do anything else. While they are talking, 500 white women and children are loaded on one of the barges, and the loading of the blacks has begun. Steamers and barges had come from all over the river. There are enough steamers essentially to evacuate the entire city in a day. The captains are told to stand by. Finally, Leroy gets out of Will one concession, that he will meet with that committee once again to discuss the decision before everyone is loaded.
Then, without Will's knowledge, Leroy approached each member of the relief committee. He too feared that an exodus of blacks would prove disastrous. His son, he said, had spoken only for himself. When the committee reconvened a few hours later, they dealt Will a stunning blow. To a man, the members now opposed the evacuation.
Although he does not admit it, he had to know right then, at that moment, that the only way this committee reversed itself was because his father had betrayed him, had betrayed him personally, had chosen Washington County and the empire he had built over his son. The evacuation is canceled. The steamboats that are standing by leave empty. Every captain absolutely infuriated over the waste of time and resources.
For Will, it was a wrenching moment. Ever since he was a young boy, he had tried to live up to his father's ideals of honor and decency. Now, those principles seemed to have lost their meaning. The next day, April 26th, an emissary from the federal government was on his way to Greenville. Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. He was in charge of coordinating what had become the largest rescue and relief operation in the nation's history. There were 600,000 refugees in the flood region. Food, supplies, and medical care would come from the Red Cross, which was setting up tent cities on high ground. By the time Hoover arrived in Greenville, he was expecting to see an evacuation underway. But when he met the younger Percy on the levee, Will proposed a completely different plan. Greenville would become a Red Cross distribution hub. The blacks on the levee would provide the labor. Hoover approved the new plan, then left town. For the whites who remained in Greenville, daily life was settling into a dreary routine. A boardwalk was built throughout the downtown area. Some merchants opened up their doors for business. For African Americans, life was very different. The lucky few found shelter in towns. Most others were herded into tent cities, patrolled by the National Guard.
When you was on the levee, you stayed on the levee unless you got a pass to be able to go into town. You had to have a tag on you. You was tagged. When you got ready to give you a shot, you had to get another tag. Your chest was full of tags. You didn't go nowhere unless you got permission to go. You had to have a tag on you. And it was really slavery.
Some guardsmen began to abuse their power. Reports spread of beatings and rapes in the tent cities. Blacks outside the camps were infuriated.